Right, two exposés before the final piece. And a think tank group called the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, is under the microscope. And this was a neoconservative think tank that was based in Washington, D.C. that focused on United States foreign policy. And it was established as a non-profit educational organisation in 1997 and founded by William Crystal and Robert Kagan. And of the 25 people who signed PNAC's founding statement of principles, 10 went on to serve in the administration of the US President George W. Bush, including Dick Head Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle, R. James Woolsey, Elliot Abrams, Robert Zoellick and John Bolton. I haven't heard that name in a while. One of the worst psychopaths. And yes, he's Hebrew, Anunnaki, Richard Perle. He was the brains behind the Cheneys, Rumsfelds and certainly Idiot Bush. Now, one of the PNAC's most influential publications was a 90-page report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces and Resources for a New Century. And citing the 1997 Statement of Principles, Rebuilding America's Defenses asserted that the United States should seek to preserve and extend its position of global leadership by maintaining the preeminence of the US military forces. Hence, the increase to around 900 US military bases globally. I wonder how many Americans know or knew there was that many. But in reality, they don't have an official number of how many bases there are. They don't know. And we, the people, are paying for those bases. And the common sense question is, what benefits have we had from them? And why are we paying for psychopathic think tank policies? Now, by the end of 2006, PNAC was reduced to a voicemail box and a ghostly website with a single employee left to wrap things up. And when one closes down, another one pops up. Now, what's behind the headlines correspondent Dan Cohen explains how top foreign policy reporters are linked to the US government, weapons industries, and also oil corporations and the very forces they are supposed to be held accountable. And he said, imagine a country where there's no separation between the government, the military and the media. And a lot of Americans would think of China, Russia or North Korea. But it's a perfect description of the United States today. And he said, here in Washington, the think tank inside this nondescript building, a Center for a New American Security, so it went from PNAC to CNAS, is the clearest example of just that. And CNAS is a premier militarist think tank in the nation's capital, especially for the Democratic Party administrations. And it's funded by the State Department and the Pentagon and has taken more money from weapons companies over the last several years than any other think tank. No, it's funded by we the people, because it's the people who fund the State Department and also the treasonous Pentagon. And on top of that, it's funded by oil companies, big banks and right-wing governments, and basically the most destructive forces on the planet. Now, for President Joe Biden, CNAS serves as a farm from which key positions in his administration are cultivated. That was an interesting term, the author of that document. he used the term a farm. And a farm is the remit of the CIA and their differing divisions. They're all called farms. And in fact, at least 16 CNAS alumni are now in key positions in the Biden Pentagon and the State Department. But what's most shocking is that several national security and foreign policy reporters from elite US media outlets are affiliated with CNAS, no surprise there, and therefore indirectly affiliated with and likely paid by the US government and corporations, again the very forces that they should be holding accountable. And for more than 20 years, New York Times Washington correspondent David Sanger has relentlessly pushed deceptions to con the public into supporting US aggression and war. Sanger, born in and born to, went to Harvard, is a member of the CFR and the Aspen Strategy Group that included such infamous clowns like Condoleezza Rice and fellow Jewish psychopath Madeleine Albright. Now, from the George W. Bush administration lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to lies about Iran attempting to create nuclear weapons and evidence-free claims from intelligence agencies about Russian cyber attacks. And these incendiary allegations were taken at face value with a clear goal to pressure the then President Donald Trump to ramp up aggression against Moscow while conveniently filling the pockets of Sanger's weapon industry benefactors. Oops. Now, Sanger's neocon cyber war fantasy was even turned into a movie by HBO. And today, David Sanger is onto the COVID-19 lab leak theory. And he's been at the front of every pro-pagan dark campaign that not only provides justification for aggression and war, but also helps generate huge profits for CNAS funders. Now, Sanger is just one of several New York Times, Washington Post and foreign policy reporters who have residencies at CNAS, and presumably that comes with a sizable financial component. Now, the reporter emailed CNAS to ask whether it pays these reporters, but they didn't respond. I guess that's a yes then. And Sanger's colleague, Eric Schmidt, senior correspondent and covering national security for the New York Times, is also in residence at the CNAS. Now, back in 2020, Schmidt was promoting the obviously false Russian bounties story, which was later retracted after it had served its political purpose to force Trump to take a harder anti-Russian stance. And he said Smith was a reliable promoter of intelligence claims about Russian hacking, yet never displaying a scintilla of skepticism. And he dutifully portrayed the Trump administration's aggression against Iran as defensive. And the Washington Post at one point found this kind of blatant media corruption at least questionable. And in 2011, the Time magazine launched a series in collaboration with CNAS to promote war propaganda, and the Post published an article questioning the ethics of that partnership. But if you fast forward to 2013, billionaire Jeff Bezos of Amazon buys the Washington Post, and its correspondent David Finkel becomes a writer in residence, again at CNAS. Now, during that time, Finkel wrote 2 books on the US war in Iraq, The Good Soldiers and Thank You for Your Service, and just the kind of whitewash of the war that CNAS funders would want the public to consume. David Finkel, born to. Michael Gordon is another. He spent 3 decades at the Times. Among his greatest accomplishments was, alongside Judith Miller, promoting the Bush administration's Iraqi weapons of mass destruction deception. And Gordon was the first to report that Iraq and Saddam had stepped up its quest for nuclear weapons and has embarked on a worldwide hunt for materials to make an atomic bomb, citing anonymous US officials. And now at the Wall Street Journal, Gordon has spent months pumping out Wuhan lab leak propaganda, once again promoting claims of intelligence officials without any skepticism. And Greg Jaff is a Washington Post national security reporter and another writer in residence at CNAS. And his article on the US withdrawal from Afghanistan quotes Elliot Cohen, a former Bush administration official who is now a fellow at CNAS. And Jaff and Cohen's shared affiliation is never disclosed in the article, which is an obvious breach of the most basic journalistic ethics. Elliot Cohen, born too. Tom Shanker used to be part of the CNAS writer-in-resident program when he was at the Times writing on US wars. In 2012, Shanker wrote this blog promoting a CNAS study without revealing his affiliation. And once again, a major conflict of interest and ethics went out the window. There is also Rajiv Chandrasekaran, who spent 2 decades doing public relations for US wars at the Post and is now doing PR for Starbucks. Thomas Ricks, whose career has spanned posts at the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post and the Foreign Policy magazine. And Ricks is a cold warrior who has publicly stated that Putin is attacking the United States just like Osama bin Laden did, and that Americans defending Putin are no different from those defending bin Laden. Now, some of this information isn't new. It was reported in The Nation more than a decade ago. But Ricks did an interview on Fox in 2012 about the Benghazi attack and walked out after 90 seconds, citing Fox was an arm of the Republican Party. But the issue has only gotten worse as US politics has shifted right, spy agencies have gained more power in the media, and the new Cold War has accelerated. And he said there's no real separation between the myriad of revolving doors and cash flow between the weapons manufacturers, think tanks, the US government and the media. It's incestuous, bloviating blob capable of producing one thing and only one thing: war. So when you think of the military-industrial complex in a permanent war state, don't forget about what might be the most important component of all: the media. A very good article that exposes the hidden nest of vipers everywhere in political circles, all backed up by criminal media, who are but patsies for the intelligence agencies. Expose 2. An uncomfortable fact which too many commentators tend to run away from out of fear, ignorance or intellectual dishonesty is the fact that the world financial system is sitting on the verge of a global financial meltdown of $1.2 quadrillion, derivatives time bomb which former Bank of England Governor Mervyn King stated in September of 2019 is on the verge of financial Armageddon. Now, this grim reality was known long before the COVID pandemic was launched during October 2019's Event 201. And it is this oncoming financial meltdown that underlies the war drive against China, which certain Western geopoliticians fear will shape the new system which they sought to control. Now, France's Bruno Le Maire laid out this fear in the most candid way in July when he said, unless we are able to reinvent Bretton Woods, the new Silk Roads might become the New World Order. It is the New World Order. Repeating the past with the Asians, sub-grey race, and the modern term Jews, they ran the trading posts all along the Silk Roads and collected many shekels. And as time moved on, they then used the Knights Templar of the Church to underpin their looting and highway robbery of the public. And so, what role does Canada play in this? And how does this affect the shake-up of the current Canadian government, now moving into a snap election on September the 20th this year? Why would Chrystia Freeland, a Rhodes Scholar, more proficient in regime change than banking, be given the reins of Canada's economic order during these trying times? Freeland, like her alt-media patsy sister Alana, are establishment clowns. Alana, like the other alt-media patsy who's disappeared now since we exposed her, Cara St. Louis, real name Orendorff, both were products of the Waldorf Training School, not teaching school. Think Svarley. So, involved in all this is a guy called Mark Carney, who is a UN Special Envoy on climate action. Well, I never. And he's the former head of the Bank of England and leading organiser of the upcoming COP26 summit to be held in the UK this coming November. Now, Carney, the eco-warrior, takes the helm again. And when Carney stepped down from the position of the Governor of the Bank of Canada in 2013 to become the first non-British Governor of the Bank of England since the private central bank was created in 1694, it was made clearly known that this Oxford-trained Canadian technocrat had been vetted by some very high-level powers. Now, after training, no surprise, for many years as a Goldman Sachs investment banker, where his activities helped fuel the bubble that nearly brought down the world economy in 2008, Carney was brought into the governorship of the Bank of Canada to take on the role as the clean, conservative-minded Canadian central banker navigating through the chaos which his former employee helped create. And it was at this time that Carney became a member of the Rockefeller Foundation Group of 30, a foundation board member of the World Economic Forum, well, I never, and a leading participant at Bilderberg and the Davos events. And while still Bank of Canada Governor, Carney was handed the keys to the Bank of International Settlements Financial Stability Board by fellow Goldman Sachs man Mario Draghi back in 2011, where he managed global derivatives regulation, which is the fuse of the international weapon of mass financial destruction, which is now bursting at the seams. But after 7 years as Governor of the Bank of England, the world economic system has been stretched to its limits, and the oncoming collapse has been accelerated by a global pandemic. The pandemic was planned to cover for it. The oncoming collapse was nothing to do with COVID. COVID just provided them with a backdrop because of efforts by the trustee at the time and the team rendered their banking system defunct, and due to their financial stealing, they lost trillions of dollars in available funds. And the money in circulation went from 123 trillion global GDP to between 40 to 60 trillion. And so they needed a lockdown of businesses and cash flow, whilst needing a cash flow themselves to fund the lockdown, which was duly provided by Trump via the trustee. Now, after 7 years in the City of London, Carney returned back to Canada to shape the Build Back Better programme, which essentially laid out a policy of decarbonisation in a post-COVID era. On August 10th of last year, it was first announced that Mark Carney was running a task force to restart the economy, titled the Canadian Pandemic Recovery Plan, which aimed at putting into motion those, quote, Green New Deal reforms, unquote, that was laid out during the World Economic Forum's Great Reset Summit of July 14th, 2020. The Green Deal in America is the remit of Mr. Pelosi. But the Great Reset fraud, and this programme is little more than a cover for global depopulation and world government run by the same arsonists who have lit the world economy on fire in the first place. And echoing the Great Green Reset programme, Freeland pointed out on August 18th that the collapse of jobs, irreversible shutdown of businesses, the unmanageable growth of a $343 billion deficit, and the phase-out of emergency response benefits will need to be green and driven by the goal of decarbonisation. And when she was asked about what is decarbonisation specifically, Freeland stated, of course, it has to be a part of it. Part of what? And it said, I think all Canadians understand that a restart of our economy needs to be green. What, Dr. Green? Why green? What does it mean? And most will assume it's healthy living and to do with plants. But what if it is the Dr. Green programme, of which Canada is infamous for? What is decarbonisation? People are carbon. And she then smiled and stated that this crisis is actually a wonderful opportunity, she said. Yeah, indeed it is, for elites and psychopaths. And she was calling for a new hierarchy of values which will shape the new system, which Carney and Freeland, both Oxford-trained technocrats, will come online in short order. And Carney stated that the greatest test whether this new hierarchy of values will prevail is climate change. And for anyone sick of the immoral, monetarist religion of free markets that have run roughshod over the world for the past 40 years of post-industrial decay, war and speculation, the proposition to change our hierarchy of values may seem like a breath of fresh air. Not if it's done by the same psychotic people, it won't be. And the problem is that the drive of a green economy of green bonds, which are war bonds, green grids, carbon taxes, caps and trades, and green banking will tend to cause humanity as a whole to suffer immensely and will strip nation states of their productive industrial potential, which is needed to resist the will of a transnational oligarchy. And like all nations, Canada's economy is extremely reliant on fossil fuels, and every attempt made to create green infrastructure grids has resulted in massive energy price spikes for consumers, unreliable electricity prone to blackouts, and massive taxpayer subsidies to keep green industries financially viable, all of which is a lie. And these problems have required the emergence of green reset task forces using a pandemic to force through changes which would never be democratically accepted under normal circumstances. Now, the Carney-Freeland Great Reset Task Force is been underway for the past several years, and both Carney and Freeland have been laying the groundwork for a new system of measuring value aimed at reducing both national sovereignty and nations' physical capabilities to sustain human life, while simultaneously and quite ironically doing grave damage to the environment, which is why it's all fake. And for the starters, Carney's task force on climate-related financial disclosures, which is co-run by New York billionaire Michael Bloomberg, born in, born to, aims to force all companies in the world to disclose all activities that either create carbon dioxide or disrupt supposed states of natural equilibrium, which mathematical ivory tower ecologists presume govern all natural states, all carbon dioxide, which we need. And on February 2020, Carney joined in with Sir David Attenborough in launching the COP26 Green Private Finance Initiative, finance being the operative word, to ensure that every professional financial decision has to take climate change into account. The right framework for reporting, risk management and returns will embed these considerations and help finance a whole economy transition. To achieve net zero, every company, bank, insurer and investor will need to adjust their business models for a low carbon world. And Sir David Attenborough has been a lifelong friend of Prince Philip and a neo-Methuselah guru who has attempted to teach the world that all of our woes stem not from systems of empires, but rather because of overpopulation, which is utter rubbish. And a recent call to leaders to correct this problem using the cover of COVID-19 is one of the countless testimonies to this misanthropic philosophy. And the Green Bankers Climate Compact, which Carney pioneered, will ensure that companies which are considered dirty would never receive loans from banks, and any insurance they received would come at impossibly high premiums as punishment for their climate-offending ways. Yes, collect all their monies using dirty techniques that damage the planet. Now we'll go green and control who operates and who doesn't. That's what they're saying. And he said, as a shining role model for good green behaviour, Carney has cited his former employee Goldman Sachs has already ruled out any future financing for oil drilling, thermal coal projects or Arctic development, which sounds good. But, there's always a but. In his paper 50 Shades of Green, Carney stated that all dirty companies with poor climate grades will either not receive loans or receive loans at such high levels of interest that they will be artificially bankrupted by taxing polluters to death. Okay, that sounds good. Let's start with the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, JP Morgan, the Warburgs and many other bloodline family psychopaths that has harvested and ruined the planet for their own greed and control purposes. Let's start with them, shall we? Now, the term dirty companies are known as brown companies, yet more colour-coded programs, it seems. Now, as Carney said in September 2019, the firms that anticipate these developments will be rewarded handsomely and those that don't will cease to exist, which is exactly what is unfolding. Essential businesses, remember? And yet another seducement program. Do as we say and we'll give you loads of shekels. Don't and we'll shut your business down. And then he said this. This means that every company working along China's Belt and Road Initiative in Eurasia, the Middle East and Africa would not exist in Carney's world, while any Western company which could actually participate positively in the multipolar dynamic would be cut off of all credit and die. What about Eastern companies? Why only Western? Oh, and we're back to the world's finances going east again. After companies have proven their greenness, simply being approved for bank loans will not be enough to carry out their business. And here Carney and his colleagues at Canada's Infrastructure Investment Bank plan to issue green bonds. Remember, bonds are war debt instruments, which today amount to only 5% of all global bond issuances, but which Carney hopes will soon attain the $3.5 trillion in energy sector investments needed every year for decades, which are required to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. $3.5 trillion in energy sector investments needed every year. What was the American budget just passed for? $3.5 trillion. Are we seeing the picture now? And by rewiring the Canadian economic system to this new system of values in time for the November 2021 COP26 summit in the UK, where he will act as British climate advisor and key organiser. And Carney hopes that the Canadian model will be internationalised so that climate change will affect the value of virtually every financial asset. And so they're setting up a new system, or planning to anyway, of economic value. But the problem with Carney's post-COVID vision is that value is tied not to the rising of living standards, human creative reason, or national productive powers of labour that characterised the creative growth of human civilization for the past several centuries, but rather upon the total inverse, by placing values on, quote, reducing human activity, reducing carbon footprints, reducing traces of human activity upon the earth. The potential to sustain life will not only be consciously reduced, but financially incentivized. Reducing human activity. Reducing traces of human activity upon the earth. What does that tell you? Depopulation, which may well be underway via the COVID jabbing. And under a new Green Deal, humanity will effectively be imposing forms of energy and practices onto ourselves. No, we won't. It's got nothing to do with us, only psychopaths. But we will stop it, which will ensure that we will never participate in any large-scale projects characteristic of the new Silk Road, Polar Silk Road, asteroid defences, etc., and will never become capable of freeing themselves from a Malthusian class of supranational bankers managing a post-nation state world order from above. From above. And the author said, if the world is truly as closed, finite and entropic as the misanthropic minds of an Oxford-trained technocrat like Mark Carney, Chrystia Freeland or David Attenborough, then this sort of post-COVID world order would admittedly be the way to go. If, on the other hand, we happen to live in an open system, creative, anti-entropic universe and express a species characteristic of transcending our limits to growth by making new discoveries and translating those discoveries into new scientific and technological progress, then not only should Freeland, Carney and the other Green New Dealers be removed from all positions of high office, but nations should join the multipolar alliance, which puts value on increasing humanity's potential rather than killing off our species under a 21st century bloodletting. We'll be back with the final piece.